please welcome Ellen Lupton to the class tonight. So, writer, curator, educator, critic, and designer at large. If you all have a design book in your house somewhere, I'm sure you have one that Ellen has been either involved in creating or contributing to. She is currently the curator of contemporary design at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York and the founding director of the graphic design MFA program at MICA.
So I'll say a few words. So I'm a curator at Cooper Hewitt, and we have an exhibition currently in our gallery devoted to Herbert Bayer, who is one of the most important graphic designers at the Bauhaus. And for the last month, our museum has been closed, and all these beautiful objects are in cases and hanging on the wall with the lights out, and nobody seeing the show. So I put a thing on Twitter saying I would love to come to anybody's class and talk to them about the Bauhaus. And it's been really fun. People have reached out and invited me to come and share my obsession. I come to design history, as someone who is a graphic designer. So I'm especially interested in how design is made. And so often when I look at graphic design, I'm really intrigued in the process. And so we're going to talk about the process and the people and the stuff of Bauhaus typography. And specifically, through this one character, Herbert Bayer, who is a student at the Bauhaus and also a teacher, but we're going to look at other people too, because he only exists in the context of this weird institution that he was part of. Yeah, and I have a book coming out with Moleskine and Princeton Architectural Press, all about Herbert Bayer. And Cooper Hewitt has a collection of over 500 pieces by Bayer. And many of those pieces are in this book and have never been seen before. So it's pretty cool. So the Bauhaus opened in the city of Weimar, Germany in 1919. And there's Weimar, there's Germany. And the founder of the Bauhaus was an architect. So we have to know this guy. This guy is Walter Gropius. Very stern, very serious dude. And he established this school. And by the time he left, the Bauhaus was the most famous art school in the world. This annoyed a lot of other people because there were plenty of other art schools in Europe at that time. But the Bauhaus was the famous one. And one of the reasons it was famous is because the school did a really good job promoting itself. And how did it promote itself? Graphic design. So graphic design is really intrinsic to the history of the Bauhaus, even when it's often in the background. Graphic design was a tool for promoting the school. It was a tool for making money. It was a tool for selling products. And it was a medium to experiment with. And that's really exciting to me. So here's the hero of our story. This is Herbert Bayer. And he arrived at the Bauhaus as a student in 1921. He was 21 years old, and he was quite innocent. He really didn't know a lot about art or design. He had picked up a book by Kandinsky called The Spiritual in Art, and Kandinsky was teaching at the Bauhaus. And he was really excited about that, and he went to study with Kandinsky. But he was an innocent. In a way, he was the perfect Bauhaus student because he didn't know anything. He didn't come with a lot of baggage. So that's Herbert Bayer. And one of the most important things that Gropius and the Bauhaus created was this thing called the basic course. And this is still used in art schools all around the world today, and it was invented at the Bauhaus. And it's the idea that when you enter the school, you are immersed in an abstract, theoretical, materials-based, experimental class. And the purpose of that class is like to erase high school, right? It's to make you forget that you really want to be an anime illustrator or that you're really into gaming and game design. Like the purpose of this basic course is for you to start over. And Herbert Bayer was perfect for this because he had no place to go but up. He was really not very knowledgeable. The first leader of the basic course was this guy, Johannes Itten. We'll call him the mystic. And he practiced a kind of ersatz, Eastern philosophical movement, kind of a cult called Mazdazdan. And he espoused this cult as well as teaching abstract art to his students. And many of his students followed his principles, which included, among other things, eating a lot of garlic. All the members of this religion were vegetarians, and their diet consisted largely of onions and garlic, which added smell to the Bauhaus curriculum. And he was into a very physical way of learning. He wanted his students to experience abstract art with their entire body. So often classes would begin with dancing and moving around. And many of the exercises were very gestural. They're very much about using the whole body to make like these big paint strokes on the paper, or ice skating with charcoal. So it's kind of cool. And maybe not what you think of. If you hear the word Bauhaus, you might think of circles, squares, and triangles, but actually the origin of the school is much more physical, much more raw, and much more expressive. And there was typography and lettering in these early years of the Bauhaus. This is from a portfolio of prints that Johannes Itten created with this beautiful handwritten typography. It's actually not typography, it's handwriting, it's lettering. And this was printed lithographically, which is a type of printing that really accommodates using your hands, not using fonts, okay? In that same portfolio of prints, which was called Utopia, there was also a series of letterpress prints. And these are made with fonts. These are made on a letterpress printing machine. And Itten collaborated with one of his favorite students, a young woman named Friedl Dicker Brandeis, designed these pages with Itten. And he credits her in the publication for being in charge of the printing and layout of these pages. And they're very intricate. And they're using sort of medieval inspired typefaces, typefaces that feel a bit like handwriting. And they have type going on curves and type making strange configurations. And this is a photograph you're seeing of the back of the page, and you can see the bite of that letterpress printing through the page. Like, graphic designers love this, right? See that making. And this is really cool. This is a proof that still exists in the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, where we can see Friedl Dicker's handwriting, where she's making corrections on the proof to tell the printer how to change the design.
Ellen, can
Really
I
wild. Yeah, please, David, jump right in.
Just for everybody, last week when we were looking at the history of the book, and I had you all sort of sidebar and look at the video from Boxcar Press where they were talking about a make-ready, this is a good example of that in practice. Here's one of those things where they would have pulled a proof from that press, looked at what needed to be adjusted. And this, you know, to me, this looks like both the printing technique as well as layout, but this is an example of what they were demonstrating in that video.
Right, how the designer had to communicate with the printer things that she wanted to change, like changing this rule so that it underlined that type instead of stopping, right? So here we can see how the printed piece versus her drawing of it. So that's pretty neat. And this is part of Bauhaus typography, and it's very expressionistic, it's very decorative, it's very elaborate, and it's amazing. Dicker did not become a graphic designer. She was much more interested in the fine arts. She did architecture, she did theatrical design. Between 1943 and 1944, she taught art to children in the Theresienstadt ghetto and concentration camp. She was a Jewish woman. And in 1944, she was deported and murdered in Auschwitz. But some of her students survived, and those students went on to found the fields of art therapy, which is really wild to think that this is part of the heritage of Bauhaus graphic design. And these are drawings by these children from the concentration camp. And we can see in them the influence of Kandinsky and Klee, who were teachers of Friedl Dicker. And she passed these techniques on to these children, most of whom were also murdered, but some of whom survived and took these teachings in a whole new direction, which is really cool, really wild to think about that as a heritage of the Bauhaus. But back to Weimar. There was a change. Go ahead. Yeah.
So go back, Ellen. One of the things we also talked about last class was the origin of collage and photomontage.
Yeah.
Intrigued by the image on the right. You can shed some light on where that's coming from.
Well, Joseph Albers at the Bauhaus did many exercises with his students using cut paper. At the Bauhaus, they had very little money. Students had very little to eat. It was really like a poverty situation in Germany in the early 20s. So making things out of what was around was really important. And imagine in a concentration camp, the limited art supplies that people had. So here it really is collage as using available material, right? And that is a tradition at the Bauhaus. Many of the avant-garde artists were quite poor. And so we think of collage as being this very expressive, creative technique, which it is, but it was also about economizing and doing things with less. So I love your questions, David. That's really helpful. And students, if you have questions.
Not throwing you off.
No, I love it. It's much better than just talking. So back at the Bauhaus, Gropius and Itten, the architect and the mystic, did not get along. Gropius had in mind a much more technology-oriented future for the Bauhaus, and he basically forced Itten to resign. He also hated the garlic smell. This was not good. And so Itten left in 1923, and he was replaced by this guy. And this is László Moholy-Nagy. He was a few years older than Herbert Bayer, just 5 years older, but that makes difference when you're in college, right? And he was hired to be the director of the basic course. So he was not a student, he was here as a teacher. And he was a very sophisticated guy. He had survived World War I, served in World War I as an officer. He, in 1920, nearly died of the Spanish influenza, which is similar to the pandemic we're experiencing now. And he arrived at the Bauhaus. He was a friend of Elizitsky. He knew a lot about avant-garde art. And he set the Bauhaus onto this new path of being more rational and more technological. So after he arrived, the school had a big exhibition to promote to the people of Weimar that the Bauhaus was a good place, it was progressive, it wasn't all a bunch of garlic-eating mystic eccentrics. And a lot of the students and faculty created these beautiful postcards to promote the Bauhaus. A lot of them looked like this, which were very expressionistic and reflected the influence of Itten and of artists like Kandinsky and Klee, who were older abstract artists teaching at the school. Moholy-Nagy's postcard looked like this. And Moholy-Nagy was the new guard, much younger, often mistaken for a student. And he brought this new constructivist influenced abstraction to the school. And I love coming in close and seeing how these things are made. So it's a lithograph. We did all the drawing with drafting tools, with the tools of an architect or an engineer.
Can you talk a little bit? Could you and maybe I'm curious. So the constructivist influence that Moholy-Nagy was bringing, where was he exposed to that? What sort of circle was he in where he would have? Well, yeah.
He was briefly part of a kind of communist revolution in Hungary, which is where he was from. And there was a whole abstract art movement in Hungary. And then he met Elizitsky in Berlin. And so he was very well attuned to avant-garde art and brought that to the Bauhaus, brought that aesthetic. And we can see, and so this is Herbert Bayer's postcard. And Herbert Bayer is like all into this new geometry thing. And really, if you look at this design, it looks like it comes out of a geometry textbook, right? Showing you how to build a triangle with your compass. And so he took those lines of construction and used them as these decorative elements, but instructional, right? And the Bauhaus was a school. And so here is a postcard that was teaching you how to do geometry. And this still exists. This is in our exhibition. This is his hand-painted maquette for the postcard. And we can see that all the lettering is done by hand. No fonts. It's all hand lettering, very precise. And he's using a little tiny paintbrush and probably a ruling pen with a ruler to make these lines in the background. And we can see him really aspiring to something very clean and perfect, like you might make in Illustrator, but he has to make it with these hand tools, which is really cool. In 1923, the same exhibition, the Bauhaus published a giant book, a catalog of all the work being done at the school. And Herbert Bayer was asked to design the cover of the book. So imagine that you're just a student at the school and you get to do the cover for this major book. Moholy-Nagy designed the inside of the book, which is ultimately kind of more important. And there's some details of the cover. It looks like it's letterpress and probably printed with a typeface. And it's beautiful. You can see the color of the paper through the ink. You know, I love this stuff. But Moholy-Nagy designed the inside of the book. And when I say he designed it, you know, that sounds really basic, but he and Gropius really created the book. He, you know, he was the younger man, Moholy-Nagy. Gropius is his boss, the director of the school. And Moholy-Nagy is really set there to determine the content and the storytelling. Like, what is this book going to be about? So it's not just graphic design, like making it look good. It's really like producing the whole thing. And this is the moment where geometry really becomes like the icon of the school. It becomes the symbol of what the Bauhaus is all about. It's in this beautiful book. And this is what the page layouts look like. It's kind of shitty, you know? And so I want you to imagine, you know, this young artist, this abstract painter, and here he's, you know, his boss says, design this book. And he's like, I don't really know how to design a book, but you just do it, right? And the book is square. I have a copy of it over here. Let me just grab. That's too difficult. But the book is square. And think about you're basically a sophomore in college and someone says, make a square book. We are going to make the type just as wide as the page, right? Now we know that's not good type, but you know, Moholy-Nagy was not someone to be intimidated. You just do it, okay? And that's what the book looked like.
Would they have been typesetting this themselves?
No. This would be all typeset by the publisher.
Okay.
And so for him to design the book is really to specify what goes where. It was, you know, somebody had to set it by hand, but it wouldn't have been Moholy-Nagy. Okay. It was set by hand by the publisher. Great question. I mean, I think it's really interesting, those kind of details about how things are made. And in that book, Moholy-Nagy wrote an essay called The New Typography, 1923. Here's a guy that doesn't even know how to do typography. And yet, here he is producing this book and realizing that typography is so important and that it's something that's changing and it's something that's new and it's something unique to mass media. And it's got to have a new language. And he and the people around him are going to create that language. And like many manifestos, you'll learn this with futurism too, the manifesto gets written before the art gets made, right? The manifesto is the call to action. And then the other designers and artists go like, okay, let's make that. And Moholy-Nagy says we're going to make typography that's abstract, that communicates, that's functional, with lines of type going at different angles. typography that you look at, right? Typography that isn't just some neutral goblet for content, but typography that's dynamic and active. So that's pretty wild, right?
So one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is Chickold and his typography. So can you just like date the two for us? And
so Chickold was born in 1898, so he's 3 years younger than Moholy-Nagy. Chickold visited this exhibition and bought this book. And he became friends with Herbert Bayer and with Moholy-Nagy and with many other avant-garde designers across Germany and the Netherlands. Chickold learned from them. And Chickold was profoundly affected by going to the Bauhaus and visiting this exhibition and getting this book.
So there's a literal physical in-person.
Direct, yes, very direct. Very direct. And he had long correspondence with Herbert Bayer in particular through the 20s. So he was very involved with the Bauhaus, although he never taught there. It profoundly affected him, yeah. So after the success of this book, Gropius and Moholy-Nagy decide that they should publish more books. And so they started a press called the Bauhaus Press, and they published 14 books about avant-garde design that are like an encyclopedia of modernism. And Moholy-Nagy designed all the books. And he didn't just design them, right? He made them happen. He helped figure out who would be in them, what would the content be. And all these books are like the theory of art. They're not pretty art books full of reproductions. They're like how to be avant-garde. They're about the ideas behind avant-garde art. And in the process of designing all these books, Moholy-Nagy became a better designer. So anytime you feel like, oh, I'm not good, I'm not worthy, I can't do this, like put yourself in Moholy-Nagy's shoes. You just do it, right? And this became one of the most influential series of books in the history of modern art. And he branded the press. This is his logo for the Bauhaus Press. It's a circle, square, triangle, pointing left. And they put that on all kinds of, bills and postcards and stuff.
What was the symbolism of pointing left? Was it left of center? I mean, is it the way
socialism.
The left okay.
Yeah, left politics. This is my tattoo. See? And you'll find that people all over the world have this tattoo. And that's my tattoo guy, Kyle. In 1925, the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, a city near Berlin, a more industrial city, and they built a whole new building, and that's Dessau. And it's this is this beautiful diagram by Herbert Bayer showing Dessau as like the center of Europe, which in a way it was, right in the middle of Germany. Herbert Bayer came back to the Bauhaus now as a teacher. He was called the Young Master, and he was given the job of setting up a modern print shop. So in Weimar, they only had art printing. They did lithographs and woodcuts and etchings. But in Dessau, they wanted to be able to print letterpress and create stuff that the school needed. And so there's Herbert Bayer marking up his printer's proofs. And they did stuff like letterheads. They did commercial catalogs that were promoting the products created at the Bauhaus. And he really tried to create a typographic style that matched the geometric style of the products, In 1926, Bayer created this alphabet called Universal Alphabet that expressed his theory that we should get rid of capital letters, that capital letters are unnecessary. We can't hear them, they're made up, they cost money. And he also believed that letters should be constructed geometrically. He never made this into a font, and actually it's pretty terrible. It was like a theoretical idea about what alphabets should look like. But it was
wild.
Yeah, right, it's not very good. right? But it's an idea. And a lot of things at the Bauhaus were like an idea. You know, and he believed that this was like, you know, much better way to communicate. In 1975, a guy in New York named Ed Bengat actually created a typeface called the Bauhaus that was inspired by Herbert Bayer's font, right? So here we have two worlds in collision. And these are what they made, right? And Herbert Bayer's typeface is all about theory and ideas and idealism and reforming the alphabet. And Ed Bengat's a New York designer who designed hundreds of typefaces. And he's like, it's gotta work. It's gotta be practical. This is America. People like their capital letters, you know? And this is still a very popular typeface. And many people, when they hear the word Bauhaus, think that this is really from the Bauhaus, and it's not. It's like bell-bottom Bauhaus. Still really cool piece of design history. Designing with photography was really important. You all talked about photomontage. Well, Moholy-Nagy was very excited about how photography was going to change graphic design. And he predicted that in the future, type and image would be managed together in one medium, which of course is true. We do that with Photoshop and InDesign today. He was very correct in predicting that. And he did a lot of pieces where typography and images get put together, where the type is embedded in a photograph. So this is a book cover.
If anybody from, what was it, 2 classes ago when we talked about the poster, recall when I pointed you all to Nancy Skolos and Thomas Waddell.
Yes.
Go back to that and look at this and then compare methods and aesthetic and style and approach. And you're going to see a really interesting contemporary and historical link.
Exactly. He was playing those same games, right? There's a book cover. In order to make this book cover, he would have painted all that type by hand on a sheet of glass and then taken a photograph of it. So the cover is the gray rectangle, and that's a photograph. It's a little hard to wrap your head around it, but it's a physical cover on a book. Pretty cool. And Moholy-Nagy wrote the book. You know, so the guy was like out of control. He could barely speak German. He had a terrible accent. He had no money, but he's just like, just doing it, you know, just doing it. It's amazing, amazing what he did. Herbert Bayer, pretty much everything that Herbert Bayer did in his career, Moholy-Nagy did first. And so Bayer made this cover that's like a similar idea. He was very inspired by Moholy-Nagy, but not at the same level of innovation, I would say. In 1928, a lot of these guys left. The school was really struggling financially. And Gropius left, Moholy-Nagy left, Bayer, a whole bunch of people left. And they moved to Berlin. They all went to Berlin to work, to make more money. But they didn't want to be poor anymore. And Herbert Bayer became an advertising designer, very successful in Berlin. But all the Bauhaus buddies stayed together. They all stayed friends and hung out in Berlin. So that's Herbert Bayer. This is his friend, Zanti Shavinsky, who was also a graphic designer and was part of this kind of inner circle, these people that were best buddies at the Bauhaus, but also after they left, continued to build a career around having been at the Bauhaus, and that's Walter Gropius. And Herbert Bayer adored Walter Gropius. Gropius was his mentor from the very beginning, from when he was a very young student. Gropius was this father figure that really was really important, professional relationship for Herbert Bayer, intellectual, broad dates later, very important. And Walter Gropius had a beautiful young wife named Isa. And Isa was also very involved at the Bauhaus and kind of running the school and running the publicity and kind of business of the Bauhaus. And during these early years in Berlin, Isa and Herbert were madly in love and had an intense love affair that lasted for several years. And despite that, the marriage survived, Gropius's marriage survived, and Herbert Bayer's friendship with Gropius survived for the rest of Gropius's life. The three of them were still incredibly close friends for decades that followed, which is kind of beautiful. And in the 30s, this is some of the work that Herbert Bayer created. He would make these photomontages that he hand colored. So I want you to think about like what you do with Photoshop today, and imagine making this where he would have cut out a photograph, probably from an encyclopedia or from a book or a magazine, and then hand painted these anatomical details on top of it. And the colors in the background, he airbrushed. And that's this machine. It's kind of like a spray paint, but it is very precise, takes a lot of skill to use. And this is an airbrush in use in an ad agency in Berlin at the time. And so he created these kind of surrealist landscapes using hand coloring. So it's photomontage, but now it's taken to this new level. There's like these hand-drawn perspective lines and architectural details. It's really illustration and photomontage together. And then the whole effect is, it kind of goes together when you step away from it. And he would use that technique in a lot of his advertisements, which are really cool from that period. And when he moved to the US, he applied these techniques to ads and political posters and stuff in America as well. This is a crazy picture of a ham with Allied bombers. Whole story behind that.
What is it for? Is it like?
I have researched this piece. It is not political at all. It is using the rhetoric of wartime production. It's 1942, so the US had just entered World War II. And it's promoting, encouraging people to buy gas stoves instead of electric stoves in their kitchens.
That's amazing.
It makes no sense, right?
So
but it has this political, propaganda feeling. That's what he did. And there's those lines again, but now in an exhibition design. He was an incredible exhibition designer. And I could do a whole lecture on that, but I won't. But he did these 3D environments where advertising becomes an immersive experience. He did information graphics, really pioneered the field of information graphics. And again, we can see the combination of photomontage and hand-painted illustration to create, as he described it, allowing you to visualize what the eye cannot see, right? It's really incredible, right? And my favorite piece of all, this was a brochure for pharmaceutical products, hormone-based products for women and their monthly troubles. And it's the uterus surrounded by the phases of the moon, right? The phases of the female menstrual cycle, all hand-painted, incredible. And those are his lines again. If you go back to those very first geometry pieces, these lines of construction that are part of the artwork, and that's the origin of life, And I'll end with these pieces, which are some of my favorite from Cooper Hewitt's collection. They're ads for men's ties. And he uses those same wonderful techniques of these hand-drawn kind of surreal architectural scenarios to advertise textiles for men's ties. So that, in a nutshell, is Bauhaus typography.